Hello, and welcome to HHH, the podcast where we talk about the horrible humans in history. I am your host, Angela Pearson, and this week we are going to explore an individual who comes from the land down under. I'm pretty excited for this one because I actually hadn't heard very much about this individual, and I'm excited to share his story with you guys because I don't think a lot of the listeners have heard of him. I always try and pick someone that most people haven't heard of. And maybe our listeners in Australia have heard of this person. I guarantee you probably have. But everyone else, we're in for a treat. So make sure if you're liking the stories I'm telling, you're liking, subscribing, and sharing this with all the people that you care about. Because what more can you say to someone you love than, look, listen to these scary stories. That's how I show I care, right? Just kidding. But seriously, share this with anybody you know likes some true crime. But today, the person we are talking about was able to turn a quiet, safe town called Perth in Australia into a place of nightmares. He was called the Night Caller. I know in the last episode I called him the Night Crawler. That's because I have dyslexia. That's genuine. So give me a break. It's the Night Caller, which is so creepy because he would sneak into your house at night and kill you while you slept. Super, super creepy. He's described as a short, slight man with dark wavy hair and a twisted mouth. You wouldn't suspect this guy to be a killer because he was a father of 7 and he was a brutal killer and a rapist. So today we are talking about Edgar Cooke. I'm so excited to share this story with you guys because, like I said, I'm sure a lot of you don't know about him, but it is a wild ride and it's going to make you want to lock your doors nice and tight at night. So let's get into this, guys. Edgar Cooke. Here we go. Edgar Cooke. Where to begin with his story? I guess we should just start at the beginning, right? So, Edgar Cooke was born in Victoria Park, Perth, Australia, on February 25th, 1931. His father's name was Vivian Thomas Cooke. That is correct. Vivian was his father's name. And his father was actually a native Australian who worked as a shop assistant. His mother was Christiane Edgar, who was originally from Scotland. His parents actually only married because his dad knocked up his mom, and in those days, if that happened, you married that woman. So they only got married because she became pregnant with Eric. So as you can imagine, it probably wasn't the happiest of marriages, but needless to say, he was the oldest of 3 children. So he had a couple other siblings, so they did continue to have children after they were married. His father, I bet you won't be able to guess this or imagine that this is possible, but his father was a raging alcoholic. So crazy, right? Like none of our other topics we have spoken about have ever talked about an abusive alcoholic father. But that was the case for Eric's father. He was very abusive, very, very, very abusive, and an alcoholic. And I'm guessing he was an alcoholic because his name was Vivian, and he probably got teased a lot for having a lady's name. But that's just an assumption that I am making. It could not be the case, but I think there's a pretty strong case for that. So Eric was frequently beaten by his father, especially when he was trying to protect his mother from his father. So he would often jump in between his father and mother when his father was abusing his mother to try and protect her. And then his father would turn the rage onto him. His mother, to avoid going home and avoid the abuse, would actually sleep pretty frequently in the staff room at her job just because she didn't want to go home and face the abuse. And like his mother, Eric would also follow suit when he was a little bit older to try and escape from the abuse at the home. He often would hide underneath their porch, underneath their house, or even roam around the neighborhoods and neighboring streets just to get away from the abuse in his home. And at some point in his life, he was even placed in an orphanage and in a couple different foster homes because of the abusive life that he was leading. When Eric was born, he was actually born with a cleft palate. In those days, surgery and those kinds of things weren't as advanced as it is now, so it was harder to fix. But when he was 3 months old, and when he was 3.5 years old, he actually had surgery to try and fix it. But neither surgery was super successful, and it actually left him with some slight disfiguration and a speech impediment. And as you can imagine, this led to a lot of bullying throughout his time at school. He was basically a social outcast and consistently ridiculed by the other children. And this caused him to become very shy and feel very shameful about the way that he looked. Now, between the abuse at home and the constant bullying at school and becoming a social outcast, it's no wonder Eric eventually became an emotionally unstable person. I can't imagine literally not having somewhere safe to go where someone appreciated you, where someone cared about you. Everywhere he went in his young life, it was very clear that no one cared about him. So, under these circumstances, wouldn't you kind of feel the same way as he did? So when he was 6 years old, Eric actually got expelled from, I'm going to butcher this school's name, Sabaco. I can't say that name. Sabaco State School. We're just going to say that's how you say it. Because he was caught stealing money from a teacher's purse. So at the very young age of 6, he started his criminal streak. Now, at 6 years old, you wouldn't assume that was going to be the future life of a child as a thief or a petty thief because they stole from a teacher. They would just assume he's a child, and sometimes that's what they do. But that is when it started, is he stole from a teacher's purse. So he was transferred to Newcastle Street Infant School, and the bullying from the other kids just followed him wherever he went. And he actually went to a bunch of different schools and was sent to a ton of different schools, like Highgate Primary School, Forest Street Primary School, and Newcastle Street Junior Technical School. He moved around a lot, but the bullying never stopped. It just would increase as he would move around. And he actually was a pretty good student in some very specific areas that required retentive memory and manual dexterity. Now, the memory thing, ironically, I want you to remember, because that is actually something super interesting later in his life, that he was really, really good at memory. And I will bring this up later, but just remember that he had a good memory. So even though he was really good with memory, he often was hospitalized for head injuries. And it's thought that he had suffered many concussions and even maybe had some brain damage. Now, two things that I want to point out about these head injuries. First, a lot of people thought these head injuries were caused by how accidental prone Eric was. He was a pretty clumsy kid, got into a lot of accidents, got hurt a lot. And they also thought those were potentially caused because he was kind of suicidal. Obviously, because his life sounds terrible. No one really cared about him and showed him any kind of kindness. But I have a theory that it could have actually been caused through his abusive father, and it was just claimed that it was an accident. I have no proof to back this up. I have nothing to back this up at all except for my own theories because there's no evidence of that. But, in a lot of abusive relationships, they usually cover up the bruises, cover up the injuries by saying, oh, they're just accidental prone. So I'm wondering if some of these brain injuries and head trauma was actually caused by his father. I mean, he genuinely was accidental prone. You'll see that when he gets new jobs, like he gets injured quite frequently at these jobs. But I do think there has to be something said about the abuse that he was facing. And he probably got a lot of concussions and head trauma from that. Just saying, there's no proof to back that up. But second, I want to talk a little bit about brain damage and concussions. Now, some of the symptoms of concussions are headache, dizziness, fatigue, irritability, anxiety, trouble falling asleep or sleeping too much, loss of concentration, memory, and ringing in the ears. So some of these Eric would experience on a regular basis, the headaches, dizziness, I'm guessing the irritability based off of what he does in the future. And then brain trauma, so brain damage, can actually cause loss of consciousness, being dazed and confused, concentration problems, mood changes, feeling depressed or anxious, which he is already super depressed and probably super anxious. So having head trauma, brain damage would make that even worse. Difficulty sleeping and more unusual kinds of sleep. So these are symptoms that he actually suffered with a lot. And why is it important that we bring this up and talk about it? Because head injuries can literally change a person. They can change a person's personality, their temperament. It can make them more aggressive. And for someone who is already depressed, it could change him to be even more depressed and lash out more because he is more aggressive. And back at this time in history, they actually didn't know a lot about brain damage or concussions or anything like that. They just didn't even know how to treat it. They didn't know how severe it could affect someone. So I'm not saying that these head injuries are what caused this man to become a serial killer, but I am saying it could have had a big impact on his future, because these brain injuries can really change somebody and make them do things that they wouldn't typically do. And like I said, this is not excusing his actions. I don't think anything can excuse actions because people always have a choice. But I think it did influence him and his personality later in life. So anyways, my psychological rant is now done. No more medical talk. Let us move on with the story. So Eric suffered from headaches, blackouts from his head injuries, and the blackouts supposedly stopped after he had surgery in 1949. Supposedly, there's no proof that they did. He just claimed they did. At the ripe old age of 14, Eric left school and became a delivery boy for the Central Provisional Stores in order to help support his family. He actually gave all of his money that he earned to his mother because she couldn't fully provide for their family with the money that she was earning cooking and cleaning. So he started working. He started supplementing the family. I don't know where his father was at this point. I'm guessing he was too drunk to do anything. By the age of 17, he actually started some new extracurricular activities at night to avoid going home to his abusive father. I bet you can't guess what those were. He actually started committing some petty crimes like vandalism arson, and robbery. He liked to steal things because it gave him extra pocket money so he could go spend money on things, since he was giving all of his money to his mother. But it also gave him something to do at night because he was a loner. He didn't have friends that he could go hang out with, so he did his own thing. He actually served 8 months in jail for burning down a church after he was rejected when he auditioned to join the choir. So he tried out for this choir, didn't make it. So what did he do? He burned down the church. And obviously they caught him. So he served 8 months in jail for that. And after he served that jail time, he actually started sneaking into people's houses and stealing basically whatever he deemed was valuable. So before he would just steal like opportunistically, but at this point, he actually started entering people's homes. He would find unlocked doors and just go in and take whatever he wanted. On March 12th, 1949, the police found evidence of his crimes in Eric's grandmother's house. So they actually searched his grandma's house because he was, at this point in time, living with his grandmother. And they found a bunch of stolen items. His fingerprints were actually matching those of an open case that they were investigating. That's how they were able to find him so quickly, is because his fingerprints matched those at this crime scene. So he was quickly arrested. On May 24th, 1949, Eric Edgar Cooke was sentenced to 3 years in prison for 4 arson charges, vandalism, and 2 charges of stealing, and 7 breaking and entering. Now, I want to point out something that's kind of important, and that's the fingerprints. He was caught with his fingerprints. This is going to be something important later in our story. And that's all I'm going to say. I always give you guys spoilers with these stories, but you know what? It's important. This is a spoiler. Fingerprints. Remember that. So, after he was finally released from jail from those 3 years, he was the age of 21. Eric actually tried joining the Australian Army. He was recruited. He started all of his training, and he actually made it through firearms training before they realized that he actually had a criminal past. And they were like, ooh, yeah, sorry, we can't actually recruit criminals because they're criminals. So they dismissed him from service. And it's really unfortunate that they discovered this after they did the firearms training with him. And you are going to discover very shortly why that's unfortunate. So Eric soon met and fell in love with the love of his life, Sarah, quote unquote, Saul Lavin. She was a 19-year-old waitress. On November 14th, 1953, they were actually married at the Cannington Methodist Church, and they had a huge family. They had 4 boys and 3 girls. So 7 children. Oh my gosh. 7 children. If you have children, just imagine. If you don't, just imagine. That's a lot of kids. So, which is also interesting because I saw an interview with his wife. I watched a documentary where they interviewed a lot of people from this time period and involved in the case, and they interviewed his wife. And she said she knew that he had been accused of stealing and he had been accused of being a peeping Tom, but she never ever believed that he was capable of murdering anyone. This was a family man. Like, they had a happy, healthy home with many, many, many children. And it's interesting because he was just this normal, average family guy, but he turned into this serial killer. So it's interesting that she wouldn't even suspect him of doing this. So it's like it's really hard to know the people that are closest to you. Bum, bum, bum. Just kidding. But seriously, like, it's just crazy that she had no idea what he was doing at night when he was wandering around. He was just a normal, average family guy. So now, before we continue on with our story, I think it's important that you know a little bit of information about Perth, Australia. Specifically, in the 1950s and 1960s, Perth was an incredibly safe place to be. People would leave their cars unlocked with the cars inside, sometimes even in the ignition, because they knew that they could just leave it and no one would touch it. It was very, very safe. They left their houses unlocked all the time. They left all their windows open because at this time there was no air conditioning. So they just opened the windows to get that breeze from the ocean. And they just knew it was safe. People often slept on their verandas or even on their own front lawns because they knew no one would bother them. And basically it was like a small town life. And everyone felt super safe and super comfortable. Now, for someone like Edgar Cooke, this was phenomenal. He took full advantage of this trust and started actually stealing cars. And like I said, he liked to sneak into houses, and this is how he got inside. He just would go in the houses that were left unlocked and take whatever he wanted. And in September of 1955, he actually crashed a stolen car that he had taken and served 2 years of hard labor. Well, he was sentenced to 2 years of hard labor, but he ended up being released just before Christmas of 1956. But this was when his crime spree was just about to take off. He was about to shake Perth to its core and change it forever. On January 26th, 1963, the town of Perth was rocked when a series of shootings began to happen around the suburbs. So all the shootings seemed to be super random attacks with no rhyme, no reason. There's no consistency of who the people were being attacked or where they were being attacked or how they were being attacked. It was all super random. And people were terrified. So first, he actually attacked a couple who was enjoying Australia Day. For those of you who are not Aussies, which for me, I had no idea what that was. It's actually a holiday that's celebrated on January 26th. It's a celebration that about the establishment of the first permanent European settlement in Australia. So just an FYI, Australia Day, January 26th. There was a couple celebrating by drinking in their car. They had parked their car and were drinking some wine, just chatting. And the woman noticed that there was a man standing outside of their car watching them. And in the interview with this woman, she said that she saw the man and the guy in the car with her just kind of brushed it off and was like, oh, he's just on a walk. It's fine. But then he never went away. He just kept standing there watching them. And it got really weird until they noticed that the man had a gun and he raised it. And before they could do anything, he shot at them. And the bullet grazed her date's neck. So he was bleeding pretty bad from her neck before it entered her wrist and actually came out of her arm right by her elbow. So that bullet traveled all the way through her forearm. And there was a ton of shrapnel that just got implanted in her arm from the bullet. And they were actually able to get away while the man was still shooting at them. So her date had the presence of mind to start the car and actually drive away. So they went to the hospital and got treated. And this is an interesting side note that I want to point out right here. So later, after more murders took place, the police had interviewed these two because they were the few survivors that actually saw the man that shot at them. And they interviewed them, and the dumb media actually released both of their names as the only living witnesses to the serial killer while he was still loose and still out there. Can you imagine? First of all, you've already been through this traumatic experience where some random stranger tried to kill you. And then your name is all over the newspapers saying, hey, they know who you are. It's basically like a neon sign like, come get me, come finish the job. Oh my gosh. When I heard that, heaven help me. It's like, are you kidding me? The media literally was like, hey, serial killer, you didn't kill these guys. You should come finish what you started. I can't even. I can't even. Anyways, that's just a side note that bothered me so badly when I was reading and hearing about this story. I was just like, you've got to be joking. They did that. Anyways, moving on. So, knowing that he hadn't actually killed his first victims, that night he continued looking for more people that he could kill. He wanted to finish someone off. So he actually found a man, Brian Weir, who was sleeping on his porch. Because like I said, people often slept on their porch because it was cooler out there and it was a safe place. So he snuck up to his balcony and shot him almost at point blank range. And this man, Brian Weir, survived for a little bit afterwards. He was in a coma and then as a vegetable, and eventually he would die of his wounds. So he still counts as a murder victim, although it took a little bit of time. But yeah, Edgar Cooke snuck up on him and just shot him point blank range and then walked away and found another victim. There was a 19-year-old that he found sleeping on his porch, or on his veranda rather, and he went up to this young man. There was clothes on a hanging line. He moved the clothes out of the way and then shot him and killed him instantly. And then he found a locked door, so he continued with his searching for someone to kill. He found this locked door. So instead of moving on, he actually rang the doorbell and moved away from the door, stood back in the shadows, waited for the 50-year-old man to open the door, and then he shot and killed him once he came out of the door, and then walked away. 5 people were shot that night, and that is the night he received the name the Night Caller, because he had come knocking on their doors. He had snuck onto their porches and killed them. So the people of Perth were horrified. They all started locking all their doors. They all started locking all their windows. And remember, January is actually the middle of summer for Australia. And this was before air conditioning. So they needed the air from the windows, but they locked up their windows. And it was so hot that people were actually getting heat blisters, but they would not open their windows because they were terrified. Because this was so random. They didn't know who was going to get hurt next. So over the next few months, his killing spree actually continued. But he never used the same killing method. And he never had a pattern as to which victims he was actually targeting. So one woman he actually killed with a hatchet. And once he was done killing her, so he snuck into her house because her door was unlocked, snuck into her house, grabbed a hatchet. He had stolen the hatchet, so it wasn't even his. Went into her bedroom and found her asleep, and he accidentally bumped a picture frame and it fell on the floor and woke her up. And so he attacked her with the hatchet, killed her. Then he went to the kitchen, poured himself a glass of lemonade, went and sat in her garden, her flower garden, just sipping on his lemonade. And when he was done, went back in, grabbed a pair of scissors, and stabbed her a few more times just for good measure. Because why not? The next person, he snuck into a woman's house and she woke up as he was standing over her. Can you imagine? Oh, so creepy. And he actually strangled her until she passed out. Once she passed out, he grabbed the cord from a nearby lamp and wrapped it around her neck and strangled her until she died. And then had sex with her body, dragged her body onto a neighbor's yard, found a old bottle of whiskey that was empty, did some things to her that I can't talk about because I'm trying to keep this as clean as possible, and then had her snuggling the bottle and left her there for people to find. See, super random, does different things every single time, and no one could figure out a rhyme or reason. And then another killing he did is he snuck into a home where a college student was actually babysitting. She was studying on the couch while the kids were sleeping. The parents were out and she was just studying, and he snuck up the stairs because she was on the second floor watching TV studying, and took aim from the stairs and just shot her in the head and left her on the couch looking like she had fallen asleep and left. Didn't take anything, just snuck in and killed her. So this was happening over the course of a few months, and people were scared. This was a very, very scary time for the residents of Perth, and police were trying to do everything they could possibly do to find this murder. Because like I said, no rhyme or reason. There's no pattern. Like, they're confident that all of these are connected, but they have no proof. There's no evidence. This person has been pretty thorough, except at one crime scene, they did find a fingerprint. And they were so desperate to try and find this individual that what they actually did is they made everyone in the area get fingerprinted to try and find this person. Like, they literally made anyone, I'm trying to remember what the ages were, like 16 up, anyone had to get their fingerprints done. And even with that, they still couldn't find the murderer. So, I know what you're thinking at this moment. Wait a second. She mentioned fingerprints, and I told you to remember fingerprints, right? So, didn't he get caught using fingerprints before? Yes, he did. So, they should have his fingerprints on file, right? So, they should have been able to find him using his old fingerprints. Well, this is why I told you to remember that. This guy was smart, and he knew he had been caught before with his fingerprints. So he actually started wearing gloves at all of his crimes. That is why there was never any fingerprints left behind, because he got smart and was wearing gloves, except for that one fingerprint. But again, they couldn't get a match off of that one fingerprint. So back in these days, I mean, if he had committed these crimes now, he would have been caught pretty darn quickly. Because think of it, like, he drank a glass of lemonade at a woman's house. Nowadays, if he would have done that, DNA evidence immediately would have been caught, because they would have had his DNA on record because he had already been arrested before and in jail. But at this time in history, DNA evidence was not a thing. They didn't have the criminal science that they have now, like the forensic science and all the technology we have now to find criminals. They didn't have that. If they would have, he would have been arrested so much sooner, because he just didn't seem to give a rip. So he left a trail of evidence that couldn't be followed at that point in time. But anyways, I digress. It's just interesting to think that if he would have committed these crimes now, he wouldn't have gotten very far, because he was really dumb. but also really smart because he started wearing those gloves so they couldn't catch him with his fingerprints like they had once. So, with that being said, he actually was eventually caught because of his fingerprints. The gun he had used to kill the college student, she was the last person that he had killed, he had actually stashed away in a hedge somewhere by a fence. Now, this is like the craziest story to me. So he was getting away with all these murders, but he'd kept this gun. So his original gun, where he went on the shooting spree, where he killed the men on the veranda and the porch and knocked on the door, he had actually dumped that gun into the river. I can't remember the name of the river he dumped it in. So this was a new gun that he had stolen, and he was still holding on to it to commit more crimes. Well, he had stashed it away in a hedge because, he can't bring it home. He's a good family guy. His wife might question where he got a gun. So he hides it by this fence. Well, there was a couple one night that was taking a walk, and the woman of this couple noticed this plant growing in the hedge, and she decided she really wanted to pick that specific plant. She called it something. I'm sure our friends in Australia would know what it is. I have no idea what it is, so I didn't remember the name of this plant. But it was interesting that she really wanted this plant. And I'll tell you why in a second. So they walk over, and when she reaches down to pull the plant, to pick the plant, something falls and hits her in the leg. And she looks down, and it's the gun. The gun had slipped out of the bush and bumped her knee. And this is why it's crazy, is this woman said in an interview that she wasn't even sure why she wanted to pick this plant. Like, she had no reason to want to pick this specific plant because her whole entire garden at home was full of this plant. She could have just gotten it at any point in time because it was right in her backyard. But she, for some reason on this walk, saw it and was like, I need to pick that plant. And they found the gun. So when they saw the gun, they immediately contacted the police, and the police checked for fingerprints. They performed ballistics tests on it, and the ballistics, the bullet, everything matched the scene from the last murder. And the fingerprints matched the fingerprints found at the last murder. So they decided to catch this murderer. They were going to lay a trap because they knew that he would come back for this gun. And so what they did is they actually put the gun back, but instead of just putting it back, they tied some fishing line to it and tied the gun to the fence post. So if he came to try and pick up the gun, he wouldn't be able to do it. So they put it back, and then they hid in bushes for 2 weeks. It took 2 weeks before Edgar Cooke came back for the gun. Now he strolled up, kind of looked around a little bit, checking around, and then reached in to get the gun. And as he tried to pull it up, they tackled him and they arrested him. And they finally caught the killer. And at first, Edgar Cooke would not confess to anything. He told him, I don't know what you're talking about. It wasn't me. But an investigator finally had enough because they had been dealing with this for so long, and it was so frustrating that he actually told him that they had enough evidence from this murder that he was going to hang no matter what. They had his fingerprints. They had the ballistic proof. He was going to hang. So he asked him if he wanted to go to the gallows like a dog, or would he confess and go to the gallows like a man. And this must have struck a chord with Edgar Cooke because it did the trick. He started confessing to everything. It was like a dam broke. He literally just said everything. Anything and everything he'd ever done. Murders, robberies, break-ins, arson, whatever. It just, it all came out. Like, he confessed to so many different crimes, and so many of them that the police literally just stopped taking record of what he was saying. They just were like, okay, keep going. There's too much. We're not going to record all of this. So eventually he confessed to all of the murders, and then he even confessed to killing 2 women that actually already had 2 men in prison serving time for their deaths. Now, this part of the story is so mind-blowing to me. So he confesses to these murders, and this is happening during his arraignment, trying to get him ready for trial. And the police thought he literally lied about these 2 murders because they thought he wanted his trial to continue longer so he wouldn't get his sentence sooner. So they just ignored it. They just brushed it off as if he was lying, because there were already 2 men in jail for these women's murders. So there's no way he could have done it because, yeah, they were already in jail for it. So they just ignored it. And we'll come back to this in a second because this is just nutso. So, I did want to mention that even when he confessed this, he provided details to the police that only the killer would know, and they still ignored him. They still ignored him, even though he gave them evidence that he was there. So we'll come back to this in a second. And remember how I said that his crazy memory was super important and to remember that he had a good memory? Well, the reason why I said that is because this man remembered every single last detail of any crime he ever committed. Like, to the point where he could give the exact amount of money he stole from a very specific wallet or a very specific person down to the cent. Like, he could give you the exact amount. And he had committed tons of crimes, but he remembered every detail. Like, he could go into, he could describe a house perfectly and where everything was situated and every last detail of, what kind of carpet it was, what kind of picture was on the wall. Crazy amount of detail. His memory was astounding. Now, I do want to point out the names of his victims. So he in total killed 8 people. And their names were Penny Berkman, Jillian McPherson Brewer, so she was married, John Lindsay Sturkey, George Ormond Wilmsley, Rosemary Anderson, Constance Lucy Madrill, and Shirley Martha McLeod. So 8 people were killed by this monster. And like I said, one of them survived for a little bit, but eventually succumbed to his injuries months later. But obviously still counts as a victim. Now, his trial started on November 25th, 1963. And although he confessed to literally all of his crimes, he actually pled not guilty by reason of insanity. Of course. They're always trying to escape the punishment for their crimes, always claiming that they're crazy, even though it's very evident that he plotted and planned all of this out. So it only took the trial 3 days to get him convicted of willful murder. The jury only took 1 hour and 5 minutes to reach their verdict of guilty. On November 27th, 1963, he was sentenced to death by hanging. Now, his lawyers urged him to appeal. They were getting ready to appeal his conviction, and I will give him credit. Edgar Cooke told them he did not want his conviction appealed. He did not want his sentence to be revoked because he had indeed committed these crimes and he was ready to die for his deeds and deserved to be punished. So I will give him credit that he actually stood up and took onus for his actions and said that, yeah, no, I do deserve to die. I should die for what I have done. So I'll give him that credit, even though he is horrible and awful and a cold-blooded killer. At least he owned up to it and didn't try to appeal his sentence. So on October 26th, 1964, at Fremantle Prison, Edgar Cooke was hung for his crimes. And it's interesting because the capital punishment was not super popular, so a lot of people protested it. For his hanging, though, there was only one protester. Only one person showed up to say that it was a disservice to the community to kill someone. No one else did, because everyone was terrified. He had struck so much terror in the hearts of the people of Perth that they were like, "Yep, he deserves it. Do it. We're okay with that." Yeah, one protester. That's it. Which I thought was very, very interesting. 10 minutes before he was actually hung, though, he spoke to a priest. And the priest was, giving him his last rites and asking, "Is there anything else that you want to confess?" And he put his hand on the Bible and said that he had indeed killed those two girls that the police didn't believe he had killed, that he had actually done it, and that the men serving time for their deaths should not be in prison, and that they were innocent. So after his death, I'm not done with that story, don't worry. After his death, he was buried in an unmarked grave on top of the remains of Martha Rendell. She was a child killer who had been the last woman hung since 1909. So he was so bad and so hated by the public that they actually put his body on top of a child killer's body, and left him in an unmarked grave. Edgar Cooke was the last man to be hung in Western Australia. So in 1964, last man to be hung in Australia. Now, I'm happy to say that the two men who were actually wrongfully accused were set free. So one of them, Daryl Beamish, he was a deaf mute, had been charged in the death of Gillian McPherson Brewer, the woman who had actually been killed with the hatchet and scissors. The lemonade woman? Yeah. He had been accused of that, but Edgar Cooke was actually responsible. The other, John Button, had been wrongfully charged with the death of Rosemary Anderson, his girlfriend at the time of the murder. She had actually been run down in a stolen car by Edgar Cooke while she was walking along the road. So this happened before the shooting rampage that he went on. The reason why the police thought it was John Button is because John and Rosemary had actually had an argument, and she'd gotten out of the car and was walking down the street, and he was following her, trying to convince her to get back in the car, and then he let her walk ahead. And this is coming from him, John Button. He told this story in an interview that I watched, and he said that he let her go to try and cool off a little bit, and then after a little bit, he kind of got worried, so he followed her and went to go find her, and he found her on the ground, and she had been run over. She had blood coming out of her head, and he took her to the hospital, and the police immediately assumed it was him. So they finally realized, okay, I guess his confession was real. So even though he had confessed, Edgar Cooke had confessed, Beamish actually served 15 years in prison and was only acquitted in 2005. And Button served 5 years in prison and was acquitted in 2002. Isn't that crazy? So Edgar Cooke had confessed all the way back in 1964, and they weren't acquitted until 2005 and 2002. Like, holy cow. Australia, get your stuff together. Seriously. Your justice system, not that I can say much. You're in the United States, but that is insane. It took so long to get them acquitted of those crimes, even though they had Edgar Cooke had provided details that only the murderer would have known. Like, that should have been an instantaneous, like, oh, I guess we better let those guys out. Oopsie. We made some assumptions. Like, oh, that just blows my mind. Anyways, so the crimes that I keep calling him Edgar Eric. It's Eric Edgar Cooke. The crimes that Eric Edgar Cooke committed would haunt Perth to this day. Like, they still, this is so creepy. They still threaten kids that if they don't lock their windows and doors, that, quote, cookie will get you. How freaking creepy is that? Like, I don't know about you, but it makes me think of a creepy cookie monster, like, coming through the window, like, cookie will get you. Oh, man. Like, that's how much he impacted Perth. Like, people are still terrified to this day and keep their windows and doors locked because Cookie's gonna get them. Like, it's just crazy that one man could cause so much terror amongst a whole town, the whole city. And because of his horrible crimes he committed against complete strangers, the death of 8 innocent people just minding their own business, and the way he tormented this whole city, that is what makes Eric Edgar Cooke our horrible human in history for the week. So join us next week as we talk about someone that I actually wasn't planning on doing, but now I am going to because I'm intrigued and I need to know more about this story. We are going to talk about Martha Rendell, the woman that I mentioned Eric Edgar Cooke is buried on top of, because I gotta know. I gotta know this story. I had never heard of her, and the fact that they were willing to bury a serial killer on top of her means she has to be pretty dang bad, right? So come with me to explore the story of this woman, Martha Rendell, because I am intrigued, and you're going to discover if I need an answer, I'm going to find it, and I'm going to give you the answer too, because I'm sure you're curious about her story too. So join us next week on Horrible Humans in History as we dive into the true evil stepmother story of Martha Rendell. I looked her up just to see, and truly evil stepmother. And as a stepmom myself, I don't know how she did what she did. So join me to see what it is that she did that is so horrible. We will see you next week on HHH. I said that weird. Anyways, we'll see you guys next week. Bye.